Welcome to KOCT's Roundtable. My name is Kent Davey, and I'm your host for this important program to help you decide who should represent the 49th Congressional District. The primary election this June 7th will decide which of the two of the 7 candidates running for this post will face off in November. As you know, this year is a midterm election, so the president is not on the ballot, but the balance of power in Congress could change depending on your vote. Oceanside is in the 49th Congressional District, which is one of the hot races in the country. In other words, a lot of money is being spent by both Democrats and Republicans to gain control of this seat. It stretches from Orange County through Camp Pendleton to Solana Beach. To give you a little background, this district was part of the so-called Blue Wave in 2018 when Democrat Mike Levin defeated a Republican and turned what had been a Republican district for years into a Democratic one. But after recent redistricting, voter registrations are now evenly balanced, so this is a highly competitive race. You could receive a ballot in the mail anytime after May 9th, and you can mail that in if you want at any time after that until primary election day. Who's running? 5 Republicans and 1 Democrat are challenging Levin in his bid for a 3rd term. In alphabetical order, their names are Lisa Bartlett, Brian Marriott, Josiah O'Neill, Chris Rodriguez, Nadia Smalley, and Renee Taylor. So stay with us for this edition of Journalist Roundtable. I'd like to welcome current San Diego County Sheriff Deputy Josiah O'Neill to the set. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Briefly, can you tell us who you are and why you're running?
My name's Josiah O'Neill, and I was actually raised in Mexico. My parents were missionaries, so I left the U.S. when I was 3 months old and didn't come back until after I'd graduated high school. We spent most of that time in Mexico and the latter years in Ecuador down in South America. Graduated early, came to the U.S., and 9/11 happened. Like a lot of young guys my age, I went off and joined the military. I joined the U.S. Army, ended up as a combat medic with 3rd Infantry Division, deployed to Iraq, came back, and then kicked off another 16 years of public service, 20 total. So I joined when I was 17. So from then till now, I've been in public service in one way or another. I started law enforcement after my military time with LA County Sheriff's Department, and then I came to Oceanside Police Department. And after I put myself through school at night, got a business degree, I was hired by the U.S. State Department, working for the Diplomatic Security Service as a special agent throughout the tenure of the last administration, Secretary Mike Pompeo there. I'm currently back in San Diego now as a sheriff's deputy.
Very good. Why are you running?
Oh, there's so many answers to that.
Briefly.
So in short, I believe that the people don't have a voice anymore. Now let's specifically look at California. As a blue-collar working class member here, I am frustrated with the state of affairs in politics. I don't believe that politicians have delivered. I don't like the establishment answer, and fortunately for me, being in the line of work that I'm in, working law enforcement, for example, both federally and locally, I'm able to see the direct effect that political decisions have on our daily lives. Mm-hmm. And frankly, after years and years of being out there in the community, 15, 16-hour days at times, I don't feel like we're being properly represented, and I want to give the voiceless a voice again. That's why I'm running.
Let's jump into some of the topics that are currently in the news. Politico ran a story announcing a draft opinion circulating in the U.S. Supreme Court that would repeal Roe v. Wade. I'm curious as to what you think of that leak. And then the underlying issue of abortion. Should it be limited to first trimester, otherwise restricted? Should it be generally available, allowed? What do you think?
So I'll just answer that in reverse order. I am unequivocally pro-life. That sort of settles my opinion in general. I believe that life begins at inception. Now, as far as the issue of Roe v. Wade and the leak, you have two, obviously, issues. You have the decision itself and then the leak. Now, the leak itself is a egregious violation of Supreme Court norms. And as we know, they've already ordered an investigation, and as they should. And whoever that is will be identified, whether that was a clerk or a justice themselves. We have no idea at this point, but the sort of sanctity of that justice process should be safeguarded. You know, that leak was from, I believe, February. And I think it's pretty apparent, as we've seen from other major news outlets now, that the leak itself was an attempt to pressure court decisions. And that is what is so egregious, in my opinion. We have a process by which evidence is provided and things are discussed. And any attempt outside that process to pressure people into making a decision is very dangerous on a third world level type perspective. So.
Okay. Also in the news lately is a administration proposal to establish a disinformation governance board under DHS. What do you think of that idea?
I think it's ridiculous. I'm well familiar with that, obviously. I mean, it's very 1984-esque. I don't think we need a ministry of truth. You know, and I think truth is important. Let's just touch on that for a minute, if we could land there. In a political climate that truly has gotten away from acknowledging that there is such a thing as truth, right? My philosophical perspective is that truth exists, there is absolute truth, and so there we define cultural norms by what is right and wrong. And I think it's almost laughable that we have a political side which refuses to acknowledge there is truth or right and wrong, and yet wants to establish some sort of entity within Homeland Security to determine what's true and what's not, when that is so often disagreed upon. It's dangerous. And as a student of history, we can see that in the past.
A related kind of issue that has been circulating around for several years is whether or not 47 U.S.C. 230, should be altered. That is the provision of federal law that keeps online publishers from being liable for third-party comments, say libel by a third party in comments or Facebook postings or Twitter,
Sure.
so on and so forth. What do you think of that?
Well, we're really playing catch-up, right? A lot of the existing laws were designed or written at a different time. Let's just call it for what it is. We're talking about big tech and companies, right? So the question now, which should be considered now, is are these big tech companies a public forum, yes or no? Should a private company be allowed to manipulate what people see or don't see? Now, if you look at data and percentages, and you'll find that the vast majority of the population in the U.S. receives their news from places like Instagram or Google or fill in the blank. So to what extent do we allow people to regulate that, especially if it's one-party sided, right? I see the example of Twitter, which has been in the news a lot recently. I didn't hear any issues with the president being kicked off Twitter and people being banned, et cetera. Now you have an individual, Elon Musk, who purchases Twitter and is just taking the sort of middle ground perspective of let's just uphold free speech. And people have lost their minds. It's an insult. It's the end of democracy. I mean, the pendulum swing is, I think, absurd. And I think that these really strong emotional responses from folks create these ideas like what you mentioned, the so ministry of truth concept. And I think it's very dangerous.
Okay. Another topic in the news recently is a suggestion the Biden administration is considering forgiving student debt. Currently, if I understand right, the average student debt is $39,000 a year. $39,000. The median is only $19,000. Should that debt be forgiven? And if so, is that fair to non-college educated taxpayers?
Short answer, no, it's not fair. Nothing's free in life, I'd argue, except for maybe the grace of God. I paid and continue to pay for loans that I take out. I mean, I think it's a pretty simple concept. If you take a loan out, you should pay it back. Now, are they too high? That's an arguable point. But I think that you need to back up a little bit in that question and say, now, if you as an individual go off and spend $100,000 on an irrelevant degree that doesn't get you a job, why should taxpayers have to pay off your debt? So in essence, it really isn't paid off. It isn't free. It's coming from somewhere. As we see in California, look at our outrageous gas prices. And if you notice recently, the Assembly just voted to increase the gas tax. It's just unbelievable burden laid upon the average person to pay for these sort of utopian dreams that we see.
Okay. Another Biden proposal to Congress is to send an additional $33 billion in support of various kinds to support the war in Ukraine. Is that too little, too much? Are we in a proxy war with Russia?
That's a difficult question because there's many variables. You know, sometimes answers have black and white, yes or no answers, and sometimes there's multiple variables. I will say the war in Ukraine is an example of sort of our weakening ability to deter adversaries around the world. And I don't think it started with Ukraine. I think it started with the ridiculous and rushed withdrawal of Afghanistan, one which, you know, I'm particularly close to coming from the State Department. I've had many conversations with folks who were there on the ground at the airport. This decision to abandon our allies and billions of dollars worth of equipment and weapons, all for some political motivation or sort of notch on the belt to say, I ended Afghanistan. There's no argument that eventually we needed to withdraw from Afghanistan. But the method by which we did it displayed tremendous weakness and vulnerability, and I think directly contributed to Putin's decision to move into Ukraine.
Okay. Inflation is at a 40-year high. Last month, the numbers were 8.5% year over year. What can Congress do about this?
Well, a lot, if we can hold people accountable. I noticed today on the way in that the Fed just raised the interest rate within the last few hours, I believe. I think that it's a testament to policies that have been put into place. Let's answer that very generally, and I know we can get down into the details, but generally speaking, leftist policies when it comes to economics are very hurtful. And we don't really have the burden of proof on that because history's on our side. Out of control inflation, loss of jobs, overtaxation, overregulation. If you look at the numbers between where we're at now and the last administration, the proof is in the pudding. So I believe in less government is better, and I think that the federalist system as originally designed is what works the best because it best represents the people. Let local communities, through elected officials, decide what happens in a republic, not some massive state entity that thinks they know what's best for your life.
In the federal budget, the defense, basically the defense segment of the federal budget is about 2.5 times the size of the amount of money that goes towards education. What do you think of that?
I think that there's different times where different things are needed, right? Now, there's a local perspective and there's an international geopolitical perspective. And I think that's important to take into account. Great adversaries around the world, like China, for example, the Communist Party in China, has increasingly spent more on their military every year consecutively for many years now. And I think it's important to realize that and counter that appropriately because if there's one job I believe the federal government should fulfill, it's to protect the citizens of the United States. Now, the other side of that, specifically on the education answer, is I believe in accountability. And so places like California, where I believe leftist policies have failed the average person tremendously, look at our rating for school. I think we're 48, if I'm not mistaken, or somewhere around there out of all the states. So my question is, well, if we keep giving you more money and you keep failing to deliver results, shouldn't we do something different? And perhaps I don't have the answer to all of these questions off the cuff, but I do believe in accountability. So intentions are great, but results speak volumes.
Okay. News reports recently suggest that Governor Newsom is rethinking the closure of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power generating plant. What do you think of that idea?
I think we need more nuclear power. It's clean energy, and it would solve a lot of the ridiculous prices of electricity and power and energy here in California. If elected to Congress, I would certainly back, if not propose, legislation that would provide for the storage and the removal of those. So Yes, I would like to remove that nuclear power plant, that one, because it needs to go, but also provide funding for the long-term storage of those in perhaps other places.
There is about 3 million pounds of spent fuel rods at San Onofre right now in
Yes.
dry cask storage. Where should that go then?
Well, I think that's partially on the federal government to provide a solution for that.
Would you want to see Yucca Mountain development reopened? It was closed, the development of it was closed some years ago.
I would have to put together a team of experts on that specific matter, in all honesty. But I do believe that it is the government's responsibility to provide affordable, clean energy. And we know that nuclear power is at least one answer for that. Ideally, we would include a budget to provide for the payment of either constructing new nuclear stations or demolishing San Onofre, for example, as well as the storage of that massive quantity of spent rods.
Okay. There was approximately, geologists suggest that there's potentially 3 billion barrels of oil underneath California soil, I guess you'd say, or water, and another 5 to 7 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Should California, or should we be more aggressive about tapping that oil and gas?
Well, the answer to that is unequivocal. There is no doubt that if we would make use of the natural resources that we have and have less foreign dependency on oil, we would all be much better off. We'd certainly be paying less at the gas pump. I would be a strong advocate for the reopening of the Keystone Pipeline, for starters. And as you just stated, it's well known that California has major oil reserves as well. So why are we not developing that?
A lot of those oils are underneath the ocean off the coast. Just last year there was another spill at Huntington Beach from an oil platform. What about the environment?
We certainly need to take care of our environment, without a doubt. That's a responsibility that we all bear. And I think if you look at, not to make it too political, but if you look at blue states versus red states traditionally do a lot better job at taking care of their environment. If you look at metropolises like Los Angeles and San Francisco, et cetera. Now, are there the potential for things like spills? Of course, and we should do everything possible to avoid that and not damage our environment. That's bad for everyone. But I'm also not an alarmist and going to repeat some of this nonsense I've heard over and over again, like the world's going to end in 10 years if we keep driving our cars. It's not a well-rounded, in fact, it's not an honest perspective, because the amount of pollution and carbon emission from creating things like the batteries which go in our electric cars is equal, if not greater, to the concerns we have on drilling for oil. So I think there's a responsible way to do it.
So can you give us a definition of where you think you are on the issue of climate change generally then?
There's no doubt that climate is changing. That's true. I think the argument, or the crux of that argument, is how much of an effect do we as human beings have on it. So, it depends on, if you look at a timeline of history, how far out you zoom or zoom in or out, right? So if you look at a pattern over the last several hundred years, you see that the weather's gone up and down, up and down, up and down. And there's a strong argument there that would say that we don't have as much of an effect upon that change as nature itself does. Now, that doesn't absolve us of our responsibility to take care of our wildlands and our land and our oceans, and I'm 100% for that, and we should do that. But I think that there's a sane, rational approach, while approaching that. So we have a lot of responsibilities at hand, like fentanyl overdoses and out-of-control crime and inflation and overtaxation. I don't think the answer to all of those questions should be, well, the weather's changing, so it's almost like a sleight of hand, a magic trick. I think that the government's responsible for all of those things.
There are approximately 11 million people in this country who are undocumented, have come in illegally. What do you do about that?
Well, that's an issue that's near and dear to my heart. I mentioned I grew up in Mexico. Spanish is my first language. Si hay alguien aquí que habla español, podemos platicar después. I really am not just bilingual, I'm bicultural. And I think that gives me a depth of perception that's often not found with your typical career politician. I understand firsthand why people are trying to get here. And many people fleeing other countries and coming to the United States are actually fleeing leftist policies, secular policies, which have led to the total destruction of their societies, rampant narco-terrorist cartels, human rights abuses, human trafficking, and they're trying to get here. So I am 100% in support of legal immigration. I think America always has been, and we should continue to be. Now, again, that does not absolve the responsibility of the government to protect the citizens of the United States. Now, having worked geopolitical issues and international crime, I know that it's not just about people trying to immigrate here. There's a public safety issue, there's a crime issue, and there's a nation-state threat. So I think those issues need to be addressed.
There were last year approximately 100,000 opioid and fentanyl-related deaths in this country. What do we do about that?
Well, this is personal to me as well. You know, coming from law enforcement, I've worked many of these fentanyl overdose cases. In fact, last year there was a point when deputy sheriffs with the San Diego Sheriff's Department here were responding to up to 4 overdoses a week. It currently is the #1 killer of 18 to 45-year-olds in the country, and I believe that number is growing. Now, speaking as a congressional candidate, I believe that those deaths are a direct result of policies banged out by legislators who are out of touch with the reality of communities and streets and things like gangs and human trafficking and drug dealers. I don't think they know what they're talking about. And I've spent a good portion of my life with these families. You know, I'm not Googling these statistics on fentanyl overdoses. I am the guy that has to kick the door down and tell the mom or dad, I'm sorry, but your son has died of an overdose. It's very personal to me. I spend my lives with a lot of these young guys, especially in the gangs. We watch them grow up. We grow up together. And it's an absolute travesty to me that I believe that they've been lied to by politicians. They've been lied to about what law enforcement does. They've been lied to about soft on crime policies. It's worth noting, a lot of this stems from Prop 47, which passed in 2014.
At least in California.
In California. That was a proposition that reduced the charges for possession of hard narcotics like killer drugs like fentanyl to going to jail, and Prop 47 changed it to just, it's like getting a speeding ticket. You get a ticket and you leave. So we had folks in possession of things like fentanyl that jumped from 1 or 2 arrests a year to 40, 50 arrests a year. I had a notable conversation with an individual who had second-generation gang member. I was taking him to the jail here in North County at one point, and we had some time where we were waiting in line. And he asked me about Proposition 47. This is in 2014, shortly after it had passed. And of course, I was curious. And he told me a story I'll never, ever forget. He said, you know, growing up, I was a second-generation gang member, and I was always in trouble. I kind of burned my bridges with my family, and for a while, the only folks that cared were the schools. And eventually I burned my bridges at school, and I got in trouble, and I was out on the streets running around, you know, doing gang stuff. And he said at that point in life, the only people that cared about me were the cops. And when I got in trouble or, you know, would get arrested, I would clean up, I would sober up, I'd get into jail. These guys would offer me programs and tell me I could change and offer me help. And there was that sort of last line of accountability there. And then he looked at me and said, you guys passed Prop 47 and essentially told us that no one cares about us anywhere. And this is an individual in his mid-40s. And he said, what do you think that tells the younger generation? Now you have kids getting out there going, nobody cares, there's no consequence for your actions.
Yeah. One of the factors driving homelessness, particularly in California, is drug addiction, opioid, fentanyl,
absolutely,
heroin, so on and so forth. Part of it is also mental health related, and that often has a abuse component to it. What should we do, and what role should Congress have? Second part of that question might be federal policy is housing first, then worry about treatment of various sorts. Do you agree with that? What do you think?
No, they have it completely wrong. And that's 100% because out-of-touch politicians don't know what they're talking about. The transient homeless issue is not about a lack of homes. All of these folks had homes. There's reasons why they're out on the street, and you aptly stated It's about 50-50 mental health and drug addiction. And actually, those lines cross over because sometimes the drug use causes mental health issue. Politicians who don't understand why people are out on the street, shoplifting, robbing people, breaking into homes, and the driving, very real addictive effects that these narcotics have, they think that it's just about not having a house. That could not be farther from the truth. And I know that if you don't understand a problem, you certainly can't solve it.
Yeah. We're basically out of time, but a quick question. If you had a scale that ranged from, you're a Republican, a scale that ranged from Mitt Romney to Donald Trump, where on that scale would you put yourself?
You know, it's a good question, and I'm a Republican because that's where I find myself most closely aligned on my moral values. I don't think that Democrats are Democrats anymore. I think the left and the far left has completely infiltrated the Democratic Party. If you were to go back to the 1990s even, none of these folks, the Democrats, would probably be Republicans. That line has shifted so much. I like to think of myself as an American. I think we have common sense grounded in historical connections to a republic, which essentially made us one of the greatest, most benevolent nations the world has ever known. We've had problems, yeah, and we've fixed them and we've addressed them.
Okay, one final question. Padres or Angels?
I'm a Tigers fan.
Okay, thank you very much, Josiah O'Neill. Thank you for watching KOCT's Roundtable. Remember, your ballots should have arrived in the mail, and you have until June 7th to either mail them back to the registrar, drop them off at a drop-off location, or go into the polling place on Election Day. I'm Kent Davey. Thanks again for watching KOCT, the voice of North County. And remember, every vote counts.
KOCT, the voice of North County.